Hello and welcome to another episode of the State of Sustainability. I'm your host, Saif Hameed, founder and CEO of Altruistiq. Today, we're going to talk about new legislation coming out of New York State, what it means, how it contrasts with other legislation in California and the EU, and how to prepare for it. But before we get into that, I just wanted to say that if you're keen to join us in person, if you'd love to meet me, share your thoughts on the show or any of your other perspectives on sustainability, I'm going to be in Chicago on April 15th hosting the State of Sustainability Summit. Please feel free to drop me a note on LinkedIn or by email. I'm available at saif@altruistiq.com if you want to attend or if you want to just meet up while I'm in Chicago. With that, let's get into the show. Today, we're going to talk about regulation and laws, and longtime listeners will know that that is one of my least favorite topics, but I'm still going to try and do it justice. So in particular, today, we want to talk about New York climate rules and regulations. And one of the reasons that this came to mind for me is that there's been a bunch of stuff happening and recent announcements. We're going to get into that. But also, I was actually speaking with one of our angel investors at Altruistiq yesterday, and he was just asking me what the landscape looks like on regulation. And I think that actually there is this sort of expectation or understanding out there, in my community at least, that almost all of the regulation applying to climate change mitigation has been rolled back, and that actually it's a pretty sparse field now. Whereas actually I think that if you compare the regulatory, I'm going to use the word burden, although I know that many in the corporate sustainability space see this as an opportunity to effect change and a catalyst, but let's go with burden for the moment. I'm going to say the regulatory burden on this topic now is actually much higher, I would say net, than it was 5 years ago. And I think the reason for that is just if you look at this sort of fairly seismic impact that CSRD and the sort of package of European regulation and then regulation California has had on this topic, it's just miles ahead of where we were 5 years ago in terms of what's in practice. I was actually at an event several months ago with Anthony Scaramucci, for anyone following Rest is Politics, the US version, or any of the other kind of Rest is Politics or Prof G podcast ecosystem. And in between his comments on my hair, he had a couple of very strange questions for me. One was he commented on the hair, and the other was he asked if I was married. And I'm not exactly sure why and why those two questions went together. But anyway, the question I put to him was much more fact-based, which was, do you actually think the US trajectory on regulation around climate change is going to kind of net move back? Do you think it's going to move forward? How do you see this playing out? And what he said is, actually, the ball is in the territory of the states now, and actually it doesn't really matter too much what the federal level does, because actually you're going to be captured by state law. And you have California and you have New York, and that's going to be basically a bit like a pincer. And if you want to do business meaningfully in either of those two jurisdictions, you're going to be captured. And of course, the New York legislation was kind of being debated and being discussed at the time. And now one of those pieces has been passed and one is imminent. We're going to talk about that, I promise. But it's really coming to pass. And so I'm kind of just watching this pincer play out. And I think it's just really interesting to go into this. So let's talk a little bit about New York specifically. And let's go into the two-track reality of climate reporting in New York. What do we mean by that? There's track A, which I'm going to kind of call the sort of micro facility level stuff. This is colloquially called Part 253. Very catchy. And so Part 253, let's just call it Track A for now, is basically already finalized. And this targets physical assets. Think about factories, smokestacks, fuel suppliers, electricity importers, all of the kind of bread and butter engineering type hardware sort of stuff. And this law is really about how do we control the actual emissions volume, all the sort of the toxic stuff going into the air in New York State, and how do we keep that to a minimum? And we want to require companies that have these sorts of physical assets and operations in the state to disclose and report what the scale of their emissions are. And so I'm calling this the kind of micro track, because this is very specifically about whether you have facilities and manufacturing and all that sort of, hardware stuff. The next track, which I'm going to call the macro track, and the reason I'm calling it the macro track is because it has another catchy name, which is S9072A, but let's call it the macro track. This one is, I think, actually much more interesting and going to have probably in many ways a somewhat bigger impact on the reporting side, is because this macro track basically says, okay, if you're a $1 billion revenue plus business doing meaningful business in New York State, you're going to have to disclose what your emissions are across scope 1, 2, and 3. But the fun stuff is really in the details, which is how does New York State define whether you have meaningful business in the state of New York? And actually, the bar is pretty low. If you're doing $1 million of revenue in New York State, that qualifies as meaningful business. If you have a reasonable share of, let's say, credit cards that you've issued, or if you have a certain number of cash points where cash is being given out, you're captured within this, regardless of where your headquarters are for your business. So let's say you're kind of a direct-to-consumer retailer, you're based in Texas, but you're doing $1 million of sales in New York State, very likely, you're going to be captured by this regulation. Let's say that you're a big conglomerate or holding company and you have a subsidiary, you might actually find that the whole conglomerate is pulled into the reporting requirements. And so actually the exposure can be very small, but you're still captured. You're still caught within the reporting loop. And so actually I think that this sort of macro track is going to be really impactful. And especially if you look at the combination of California and New York State, where you're basically saying, well, if you're an American business and you're not selling $1 million in these two states, really, what are you doing at that kind of scale in the US? And so I think actually the sort of Scaramucci line is really coming home to me, which is, again, not about my hair, but the fact that these two states are capturing in this sort of pincer movement American business means that whatever happens at the federal level, I'm thinking about the step back on the SEC regulations sort of becomes a bit moot. I think this is going to be a really interesting one to watch. The macro track is not yet final, but it's cleared the Senate, which means that it's now moving to the sort of the House, I guess you call it, at the state assembly level, or the state assembly. But its passage is widely accepted to pass because New York is a heavily skewed blue state and the governor has indicated support for climate change regulation. So I think this is going to be really quite impactful and really quite sizable. It is a more or less a lift and shift. This macro track is more or less a lift and shift of equivalent legislation in California. One of the other interesting bits, and I'm kind of looking at whether this can be stepped back from, so whether actually you can have a repeal, whether it can be watered down. One of the really interesting things is that the way that the legislation is structured is that it basically opens the door to citizens taking legal action if the legislation is watered down. And that means that actually if subsequent governments do decide to take a step back, actually they can be sued, which I think is a really major deterrent. Aside from the fact that New York is heavily blue and kind of heavily skewed by Democratic voters in New York, let's say liberal or left-leaning voters in New York City, who are quite in favor of climate change-related regulation, I would say there's this sort of almost poison pill, basically, when it comes to rolling back any of this legislation. So I think that's going to be a really interesting one to watch. One of the other things that I was looking at is how does this compare to equivalent legislation in Europe? And I think what's interesting is, and I also want to talk a little bit about why we think that the New York legislation will be resilient versus what we've seen happen with CSRD and Omnibus in Europe. In Europe, the threshold is actually a lot lower. So it's not $1 billion revenue business. It's a much lower bar for how big you need to be for this to. This podcast is brought to you by Altruistiq. Sustainability teams have one thing in common. They all have messy data sitting in silos across the business. This means 60% or more of their time is spent getting data into shape and not making sense of that data or using it to drive action. Altruistiq's AI-based tools can help. Meet Evie, your in-house, always-on-call sustainability assistant. Evie works alongside you and your teams to clean up and transform your enterprise data into usable emissions calculations. Even better, Evie helps you interrogate this data, working like the junior analyst you wish you had. AI alone won't solve all your problems, but data transformation is one you can cross off your list. Visit altruistiq.com to find out more. That's Altruistiq with a Q. Hi. You're listening to The State of Sustainability. So, talking about what the differences are between the New York and California legislation and the EU CSRD, and I'm focusing really on the macro track, that piece that governs whether the scope 1, 2, 3 reporting is required based on business exposure. There are a few interesting differences. One is that the revenue threshold on the CSRD side is actually much smaller. We're looking at something like 50 million euros turnover, 25 million euros in assets. This is not a super high bar, which is why the number of companies that are expected to be captured is in the thousands. And if you look at what the original pre-omnibus assessment was from the impact assessment that the European Commission ran, it was something like 48,000 companies were expected to be in scope. Scope 1, 2, and 3 were required across all of these legislations, so New York, California, and the EU. I'm going to come to assurance in a little more detail, but I think really key was that all of these pieces of legislation required third-party audit and assurance for the Scope 1, 2, 3 reporting that was going on. But another key difference is that the California and New York legislations focus on carbon emissions purely, or greenhouse gas emissions purely, whereas the CSRD was quite broad from an ESG perspective. And I think that as this played out, this ended up being... There's a few of these things that became the Achilles heel for the CSRD, which is why we got omnibus and got this sort of backlash or greenlash, as the kids say. And one of it was that because the bar was so low in Europe for whether you're in scope, it kind of became like an everyman law. Like this just hits everyone. This hits, a farming cooperative in the Netherlands. This hits a mid-size automotive supplier in Germany. This hits really the bread and butter of business, which means that the impact was felt quite widely. And the cost doesn't necessarily scale down if you're smaller. Like the cost of getting your emissions reports assured or audited by a third party aren't a tenth of the cost if you're a $100 million revenue business versus if you're a $1 billion revenue business, actually, let alone the data gathering infrastructure, specialized human resource, skills, all of that goes in. And so actually, if you read the impact assessment that the European Commission ran before passing the CSRD, which I did, I will never get those hours of my life back, then actually the impact assessment costed what the cost is likely to be to an average business, and it was in the millions. The cost of making all this sort of data reporting not go away, but kind of stay and be done and be easy and be addressed. And that's a really high bill. I remember I was kind of doing some fun back of the envelope math at a conference once. And I was kind of just working out that if you take like a smallish farming business and you look at the cost that a smallish farming business would have to comply with requests from its customers related to, let's say, upstream CSRD compliance. You're a farm supplying a business. The business is covered by CSRD. It's now asking you for some data. You have to give the data back, surveys and whatnot. I estimated that it would probably be something like a few $1,000s in cash and, maybe a few thousand more in kind. Now, having owned and run a small farming business, I know that your profit, your EBITDA is maybe 30,000, 40,000, right? Like for I'm talking about a successful small farming business. An unsuccessful small farming business like the one I had is in the negative. But a successful small farming business might be doing 30, 40,000, in which case you're saying, well, 10% of your profit goes on reporting and compliance. That doesn't sound right, let alone all the other stuff that you kind of need to do around toxicity and effluent and all the other costs of running a farm, which, frankly, is no joke. And so actually the fact that the bar was so low and so many people were caught made this already pretty difficult. You started to get a lot of backlash from farmers, particularly in the Netherlands and Belgium, for instance. And those are very vocal, very politically active communities that can sway elections as well, which is why you start to get then, as the law was expected to be localized, you start to get some step back. That takes us to a second problem you had in the EU, which I don't think you're going to have in California and New York, which is that the EU is actually super fragmented. Many times you sort of think about the EU as one entity, but there's this famous Henry Kissinger line, which is, who do I call when I want to reach Europe? Any EU legislation ultimately doesn't just need to navigate the sort of the gamut or the gauntlet of all of the internal policies. It's like a Prince of Persia game, right? When all the sort of things are coming in your way and you have to jump through hoops literally to get legislation passed. But once that happens, it has to kind of go through at the country level for each member state to try try and bring its own version of those laws into practice. This is my college level European law coming back to haunt me. And actually, for legislation to survive that, stay in practice, not be watered down later, follow through all the way to the finish line, it takes years, and there's a lot of risks there. In California and New York, by comparison, it's a single state, each of these, actually. And the single state is controlled, often by a single party. They might have both the upper and the lower houses. They might have the governorship as well. And so actually, it's much more resilient from a legislative perspective. The other thing that I think made the CSRD much more complicated to defend than California or New York when it comes to these two laws that we're talking about now is the fact that the CSRD was a broad ESG kind of catch-all set of rules. And when you look at just the sheer number of metrics that got covered, the sheer scale of all that you had to measure and track and gather, this is massive. And again, just added to the burden. One of the things that I got asked again by this investor of ours was actually like whether I was optimistic about more legislation coming through in the coming years. And I think my answer probably seemed a little surprising, which was I'm kind of hoping more legislation doesn't come through. I'm really hoping it stays where it is and nothing new comes through the door to drive more climate change mitigation. And that sounds like an odd statement for me to make, given that I'm in the climate change mitigation business, literally. But my reason is that I actually think we as a community have much more to lose from greenlash, from step backs from legislation. It is actually much better for us if legislation comes through, it is well socialized, well understood, it is just about palatable to the stakeholders that it covers. It's never going to be cheap. It's never going to be easy, but everyone can kind of live with it. And you sort of move on and you raise the bar slightly. Most of the big wins when it comes to climate change mitigation have been relatively unnoticed by the average individual and by the average business, and they've just happened. Let me give you two really good examples. One in the UK, where the UK transitioned from coal to natural gas over the course of the 90s. Massive impact, actually, on the UK's emissions profile, just huge. But if you ask most people living through the mid-late 90s whether that was one of the big things that they noticed, if you ask most businesses, was that one of the big things that was disturbing your sleep at night? I don't think people would have commented because it kind of happened seamlessly in the background. Same thing with the US. If you look at the US kind of moving over to gas and away from coal, the sort of shale gas availability in the US over the recent decade, a lot of that has just sort of happened. If you look at in Texas, the solar power drive based on, maybe based originally on incentives, but ultimately based on plentiful sunlight available in Texas, plentiful space to put up solar farms. A lot of that has just sort of happened. It's not caused anyone much pain. And so most of these transitions ideally shouldn't be super painful. And sometimes I think legislation can go a little too far, a little too fast, and trigger a massive step back that leaves you worse than where you started. What I've noticed now, let's go on the social side of the ESG topic, which is something I try never to do on principle. But if you look at, let's say, diversity, equity, and inclusion, DE&I, it has now become a bad word. Literally, you cannot now go into boardrooms, you cannot go into management rooms and talk about DE&I and expect to be invited back. And this is, maybe most true in the US, but it's not like it's a long way from the truth in the UK or Europe either. And this was not the case 7 or 8 years ago or 9 years ago. It became the case, I think, because a lot of this stuff entered the mainstream political debate in the context of legislation, in the context of what was seen as government overreach, and then triggered a massive backlash. I actually think people were much more ready to discuss it and to act on it. And I say this having authored a diversity, equity, and inclusion report at McKinsey in 2018 or so when I was there. It was an interesting topic for mainstream management to talk about. And I just feel like sometimes the step back does more harm than good. So to come back to it, I think that the New York and California legislation is here to stay, in my view. I don't think we're losing it anytime soon. I think that one of the biggest impacts that we're going to see, I think there's actually probably two things that we're going to see. One is because Scope 3 is captured, And they've given a little bit of space. So they've said that the scope 3 doesn't need to be fully accurate, but the scope 3 needs to be a best effort basis calculation. I think that because that's covered and because the bar, again, for you to be captured by this legislation, $1 million of business in the state is so low, I think you're going to see this sort of wave or this trickle-down effect where for large companies in the US, frankly, any large company globally doing a lot of business in New York, you're going to see a lot of this sort of trickle-down of data requests, collaboration requests. Once this data is out there in the public space, you're going to want to see the numbers move as well. No one wants to be reporting rising emissions year after year in an environment where you're forced to disclose that. And so I think we're going to see a big cascade come. I don't think it's going to be quick, but I think it's going to be big. I think it'll take several years, frankly, because this legislation doesn't fully come into effect for the next couple of years. But I think it's going to be a really big gathering tide. The other piece that I think is going to be really interesting is the third-party audit requirement. I know from having seen how this played out in Europe that that's driven a lot of focus and rigor on how data is treated, how data is gathered, how it is calculated. It's triggered a massive shift, for instance, from spend-based calculations, which used to be the norm, towards weights, activities, locations, all these sort of tags associated with the calculations being done. And I think we're going to see that now hit a massive wave of mainstream American business in a big way, which is going to be really interesting. And then there's a sort of an overall comment as well, which is it is still a globalized world, despite these sort of anti-globalization forces all around us. And if we're basically living in a world where every large business has to cater to the highest bar of regulation anywhere that it does sizable business, then actually I kind of think we're going to see the whole threshold move up. I actually think we're going to see over the next several years business practice just shift on this topic permanently, regardless of whether one of these pieces of legislation is less resilient than others. So, I think it's going to be an interesting time to watch this space play out. So that's my rundown of the new legislation coming out of New York. If you have a suggestion for new content that we should feature, or if you want to know what my responses were to the mooch when I met him, then just feel free to drop me a message on LinkedIn. Very happy to get back to you. But otherwise, till next time, if you enjoyed this episode, please hit follow, and it never hurts to share it with a friend.